This will be a series of new stamps dedicated to the most outstanding buildings of diplomatic establishments abroad with an architectural value. It is opened by 4 stamps. The former reception house was the venue for many agreements. You see it almost every week during the negotiations of the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry with its foreign counterparts. The residence of the Russian ambassador in Paris became the venue for the stop of the Emperor Nicholas II. The embassy in Vienna was the venue for summits. Our embassy in Beijing is relatively new. It was commissioned to service in 1959 to mark the 10th anniversary of diplomatic relations with China. At the same time, let me remind you that this is the largest from the point of view of its territory and from the point of view of architecture building among all ambassadorial buildings of all world powers. This stamp implements an augmented reality technology. This is why we can see its luxurious interior designs. You can also download a corresponding mobile app. We will provide the links in the text of today's briefing. The authorities of the Ministry of Digital Development will also take part in this ceremony, as well as the representatives of the Post of Russia. On February the 16th, Sergey Lavrov will make a presentation during the plenary session of the Forum Against Modern Neocolonial Practices. It will bring together representatives of leading formations from Africa, Eurasia, Latin America. This is the initiative proposed by the United Russia Party, was supported by the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. As key tasks, we see elaboration of substantive and comprehensive measures to counter neocolonialism and initiating a permanent international mechanism which would ensure coordinated approaches to fight neocolonialism. On February the 19th, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergey Lavrov, will pay a visit to the Republic of Cuba. We have scheduled visits with the President of Cuba, the Foreign Minister of Cuba. During the discussions with our Cuban partners, they will discuss relevant agenda of bilateral cooperation as well as global and regional agenda. The further aspects, the key aspects of Russian-Cuban strategic partnership will be in the spotlight of the negotiations. The parties will also discuss trade, science, culture, and humanitarian ties. Russia and Cuba will analyze cooperation to prevent undermining the principles and norms of international law. UN Charter will discuss how to counter neocolonial practices and illegitimate restrictions in international relations. On February the 20th, Minister Lavrov will pay a visit to Venezuela. He will hold talks with the President of Venezuela and the caretaker vice president, as well as negotiations in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Venezuela. The parties will discuss the prospects and the current state of affairs in our bilateral relations, the implementation of key joint projects in trade, investment, culture, and humanitarian ties. The parties will exchange opinions on key issues of international and regional agenda, cooperation in the framework of the United Nations Organization and other international platforms. From February 21 to February 22, Sergey Lavrov will participate in the meeting of the heads of foreign ministers of the G20 in Rio de Janeiro. This will be the first meeting with an emphasis to settle international differences. Our Brazilian friends view progress in this agenda as an integral part, a precondition for bringing world economy to the trajectory of sustainable growth. Minister Lavrov will represent Russia's ideas and views of challenges that the international community faces, their internal reasons, root causes, dynamics, and needed steps to overcome them. We will emphasize the need to use all diplomatic tools, the tools for peaceful settlement of all conflicts, mutual respectful dialogue, Given all geopolitical realities, we will call upon our G20 partners to fully support the construction of the truly democratic multipolar world on the basis of mutual accommodation of interests of all peoples and nations. We will speak against weaponizing international economic relations, hybrid warfare, undermining sovereignty of independent states, and interference into their internal affairs. We will insist on respect of the primacy of international law as enshrined in the UN Charter, bring back the practice of adoption of collective solutions with all the parties concerned in line with the common denominator search. On the sidelines of this session, Minister Lavrov will have an intense schedule of bilateral meetings. The countries with the emerging markets will also be represented. One more important date, February the 14th. Today we mark the 90th anniversary of the Diplomatic Academy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The main task of this educational institution, which was established in 1934 to train consular and diplomatic workers, to provide personnel training with patriotic attitude for foreign policy service. This task was successfully implemented over the course of its existence. It has earned the reputation as a reliable educational platform for specialists in foreign affairs. They have trained more than 800 ambassadors and representatives for international organizations annually. The Diplomatic Academy provides qualification training for 750 Russian diplomats. Moreover, the Academy is a great scientific center which improves concepts of international research. For the achievements and on the occasion of its 90th anniversary, the Diplomatic Academy received a certificate of acknowledgement by the President of the Russian Federation, and many representatives received the awards to mark this occasion. Of course, we join the greetings that the Diplomatic Academy of the Russian Federation receives on this occasion. Also, I would like to say a few words as to the work carried out by our embassies. I mean the preparation of the presidential elections abroad. We continue our work to organize elections in our diplomatic missions abroad. In this regard, on February the 8th, in our press center, we had a briefing of the head of the Central Election Commission, Madam Pamfilova, for the representatives of the diplomatic corps with accreditation in Moscow. We will copy the link to the text of the briefing. The heads of diplomatic missions from more than 130 states became the participants of this briefing. Madam Pamfilova spoke about peculiarities of the election processes. She also communicated Russia's approaches as to digital solutions. She dwelt on the international observers' work invited by the Federal Assembly, Central Election Commission, and accreditation for mass media representatives. We do not know the exact numbers now, but we expect from 500 to 1,000 international observers from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. They will receive accreditation in the Central Election Commission, and later they can go to any point in Russia to monitor the process. As soon as we receive official responses, we will publish the full list. As I have already stated during my previous briefing, we are going to open around 270 ballot stations in all the states where we have diplomatic missions abroad. However, we have to underscore that security at ballot stations is a reason of great apprehension and concern. Many European and American states have not responded so far to Russian requests for guaranteeing security at balance stations. In this regard, we won't hold voting at home in non-friendly states outside the cities where our diplomatic missions were located. As you know, previously we had an opportunity to hold field elections at honorary consulars' offices, at culture centers, and also in establishments provided by the authorities of the state to guarantee security and safety of the citizens. They will have an opportunity to vote only at Russian diplomatic missions. I would like to remind you that at the request of non-friendly authorities, 26 Russian diplomatic missions were closed, dozens of diplomats were expelled. This considerably lowers the possibilities, the capabilities of opening additional ballot stations. I mean the Baltic states, Moldova, Germany, United States, Finland, and others. Also, we see obstacles to organizing the preparation work, financing of the election campaign, and so on. Besides, we see the increasing number of appeals to undermine the election. We warn all extremists of criminal responsibility for any attempts to disrupt the elections. Now the election commissions are being formed actively. They will be led by the heads of diplomatic missions abroad. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs does everything possible to ensure effective voting process for the citizens of Russia living abroad. We will keep you updated as to the preparation to the election abroad during the briefing. You will also find the information on our social media accounts and on the official website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and of course from mass media sources, both in our central office and our diplomatic missions abroad. Now we proceed to the relevant agenda. The situation around Ukraine. On February the 18th, we will mark 10 years anniversary from the turning point of Euromaidan in Kiev. On this very same day in 2014, the alleged peaceful anti-governmental manifestations escalated into large-scale acts of violence. The headquarters of the ruling party was seized. 2 members died. The rebels attacked the local police and other law enforcement agents who did not use arms in response. The Western masterminds of these street riots were pushing the rebels forward, thus escalating the situation. At the same time, the leaders of Western states overtly interfered into domestic affairs of Ukraine, and then they intimidated the authorities of Ukraine, saying literally, if the president or law enforcement structures will use arms to bring the things in line with the constitutional order, in this case, Ukraine and all those who adopted the solutions will face the correspondent measures of influence. During February the 18th and February 19th, 29 Maidan fighters died, as well as 11 policemen. Hundreds of people were injured. The situation triggered violence, which later claimed lives of many people and maimed millions of fates. Ukraine was approaching a violent coup d'etat. All these years, the Kiev regime was trying to distort the truth. Besides, right now we've passed one more memorable date. On February the 12th, 9 years ago, thanks to the efforts of intermediaries, Russia, Germany, and France, we managed to negotiate the package of measures to implement Minsk agreements. It had to put an end to this violent civil war in Ukraine, which was the result of the coup d'etat in 2014, the civil war which was unleashed against its own people by the Kiev regime in southeast Ukraine, sending tanks to attack people who were in favor of preserving constitutional order. Back then, this package of measures was signed by all the parties to the conflict. The resolution 2202 of the Security Council was approved. It became the foundation of Ukrainian settlement and an integral part of international law. The package of measures was a unique chance to preserve peace in Ukraine, but the Kiev regime missed this opportunity. The Kiev was not even thinking of implementing the agreements achieved. The key precondition for lasting and comprehensive peace was setting a direct and mutually respectful dialogue between Kiev, Donetsk, and Lugansk. But both Poroshenko and Zelensky neatly refused the very idea of direct communication with the Donbas people. They were calling them their citizens. They were unwilling to communicate with their own citizens. They were not considering them to be people. They were openly qualifying them as, well, filth and creatures. The Kiev regime violated the package of measures, and it received no response from the European guarantors, Germany and France. We have repeatedly drawn their attention to the inaction of the Kiev regime, but as we later understood, Berlin and Paris were doing this deliberately. They were going to prepare the Kiev regime for a military fight against Russia. Without any regret, the former Chancellor Angela Merkel and the former President François Hollande confessed this. Back then, they used to be proud of their co-sponsorship of the package of measures, and later, it turned out that they cheated the whole world. They cheated everyone who expected peace in Ukraine. They cheated their own citizens who voted in favor of them and in favor of the political forces they represented. Also because they were playing the role of the so-called peacekeepers. They were not going to implement this role. They cheated the UN Security Council when the package of measures was represented, when it was elaborated in front of the eyes of the world community, when it was becoming legally binding document. They were not saying that they were not going to implement this, and it is a fraud. In the context of a violent crackdown on Donbas, which would result in mass deaths of civilians, Russia could not but step in. We had no other choice but to launch a special military operation to protect the people of Donetsk and Lugansk people republics. We could not leave the Russian people at the mercy of Bandera soldiers, the Russian-speaking people who associate themselves with the culture and with the language of the Russian Federation, peoples of different religions, peoples of different nationalities. Those were people who were seeking peace. What did they receive? An attempt to exterminate them. Now, Ukrainian neo-Nazis do not stop barbarous artillery shellings against civilians of Russian regions. According to the authorities of the Donetsk People's Republic, from the beginning of this year, 58 people died, 204 people were injured. On February the 9th, Russian air defense downed 19 drones. It was carried out in 4 Russian regions over the waters of the Black Sea. On February the 11th, in Kherson region, 33 Ukrainian drones were downed. At the same time, the West ignores terrorist activities of the Kiev junta, turning the blind eye to any threats. The other day, the Minister of Digital Development of Ukraine, Mr. Fedorov, made himself prominent by the statements in the style of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. He promised large-scale explosions on the territory of the Russian Federation. I have something to ask for the Kiev regime. Don't say that it was not you, that these are fake news. You are saying this, and we remember this very well. We record all these statements. Our law enforcement agencies are in charge of this. No one should harbor any illusions that these atrocities and these statements will be left unpunished. Russian law enforcement agencies monitor closely, and all the responsible will be brought to responsibility. If you need any examples, here they are. The tribunals of the Russian Federation, on the basis of the evidence collected by Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation, are still announcing sentences to Ukrainian militants committed against civilians. 33 Ukrainian neo-Nazis received from 27 up to 29 years of imprisonment for the crimes against civilians of the Donetsk People Republic. Ukrainian militant Chernushenko received 25 years in prison. No one of the criminals will be able to escape responsibility. They will respond to the severity of law. Today, on February the 14th, Brussels will become the venue for the 19th meeting of the contact group in Ramstein Forum. The agenda is the following: providing air defense systems to Kiev and other munitions relevant for the Ukrainian armed forces. But even the United States cannot figure out what to do with funding for the Ukrainian regime. They are trying to shoulder the burden of all the expenditure to Europe, first and foremost to Germany, which is the leader in this regard. The Chancellor Olaf Scholz came to Washington to receive the corresponding instructions. In an emotional manner, he called upon the West to do everything possible to prevent the victory of the Russian Federation. Previously, they were trying to defeat Russia strategically. Now the rhetoric is different. They understand the reality very well, and they say that they should prevent the victory of the Russian Federation. I would like to disappoint them. Neither the first came true, neither the second will. The essence of the statement was the following: if we give Russia an opportunity to win, the golden milliard will risk to live in an unpredictable world, which will be even more dangerous than during the period of the Cold War.
And neo-Nazism is being reborn in Germany, because we can see the German government officials talking about ancestors, Nazis, and how it is popular in the entire Germany, how that devilish Mein Kampf heritage of Hitler is being republished, and I will mention it further. The criminal nature of the Kiev junta, despite that, the European politicians claim that Ukraine is allegedly the savior of Europe from Russia. It's like a stone around the neck. It's like drowning Europe. So it used to be a prosperous country. And for the European functionaries, they do not care what their own citizens think about that, because the Ukrainian armed forces are sponsored by them. And they just turn a blind eye to how the economy is collapsing, to the social situation being destroyed in a Europe that used to be prosperous. And against this background, we see the protests of farmers who really work. They get their earned money not because of speculations, not because some operations with assets, not by making some bubbles in real estate or digital technologies markets. No, they just provide what is essential for everyone: food, nourishment. And they are now deprived of their profits due to cheap Ukrainian food. They are facing a rise in energy costs due to criminal policy of the European Union with regard to their own citizens. And where do their taxes go? They do not go to the infrastructure in their countries, not to security of their countries. They go directly to this war that is headed by Zelensky, the puppet of the United States of America. And his regime continues to demonstrate its true face. On the 11th of February, the director of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra Museum Reserve, Maxim Ostapenko, declared his intention, just listen to that, to exchange the captured Ukrainian soldiers to the remains of Pyotr Stolypin, who was treacherously murdered in Kiev in 1911 and buried on the territory of this monastery, now turned into a museum. The Ukrainian neo-Nazis, it's not the first time they are trying to dance on bones, because there have been many data of their trade in sacred remains, sending them abroad. They tried to use the grave of Nikolai Kuznetsov and Nikolai Vatutin, buried in Lviv and Kiev, that nothing sacred remains for the Kiev regime remains. It is obvious. On the 22nd of January, the Kiev neo-Nazis brutally beat Metropolitan of Benchansk. Thanks to his efforts, hundreds of orphans and children deprived of care were saved since the 1990s. For that, he got the title of the Hero of Ukraine. The Zelensky regime is disgusted by the fact that the Metropolitan does not renounce his faith and remains loyal to the canonical church, which Kiev regime is so shamelessly destroying. He was accused of inciting interreligious discord. So again, it's a story about children, what is connected with children, with saving them, protecting them from some destructive logics. So that's the reaction of the Kiev regime. It's just barbaric acts. But why? Because children for the Kiev regime, it's also goods. And we call on international organizations to issue a strong condemnation against the Kiev repression against the Orthodox Church and to stop this arbitrary behavior. And we will continue to perform our tasks to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine and eliminate the threats that emanate from its territory, and they will be definitely fulfilled. Regarding Moldova, we see the government in Chisinau taking efforts for the project of they call it European colonization. They just use all the methods available. The Moldavian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mihai Popșoi, on the 7th of February, said that, quote, the CIS was designed to limit the independence of the so-called post-Soviet countries, end of quote. But they lack facts to confirm their fairy tales. So the CIS is a constantly developing mechanism of interstate interaction in many areas. It's politics, economy, military, security, cultural and humanitarian cooperation. On the basis of the real and not declarative principles of mutual respect, equality and mutual consideration of interests. So this interaction is carried out on the CIS space. Second point, in the CIS, unlike the EU and NATO, no one forces anyone to do anything. The mechanisms are structured in order for each state to consider each other's interests and needs. The third point, the economies of the CIS countries are developing dynamically. In 2023, the total GDP increased by more than 3%, 3.2%. Next point, the CIS has established effective mechanisms to counter traditional as well as new challenges and threats, including crime, terrorism, and extremism. Fifth point, there are many projects, large-scale projects, sports, cultural, youth events. So there are many events, and we can see the economic figures and the opinions of the people having participated in them. And regarding the Moldovan apple exports, in 2022, it was 190,000 tons approximately, of which only 5% went to Romania. So where the other share goes? 74% to Russia, 8% to Kazakhstan, and 6% to Belarus. So in the first half of 2023, it was more than 50% of Moldovan apple exports for our country. So the Moldovan authorities see all that. But the citizens of Moldova see that the European Union, what the EU countries have done to their own farmers in Poland and in other countries of the European Union. And that will be their fate because of the officials in Chisinau, because it has been paid through NATO structures. They have ensured their posts and forcing the country to be destroyed by NATO. I would like to remind that the EU is a deeply ideological bloc, and it rudely imposes its rules and standards on other countries. And what has been accepted and in what Moldova participates, for example, within the OSCE. And this bloc has already been brought by the EU to economic stagnation, industrial decline, and social tension, where the notorious intra-EU solidarity has turned into a political obligation, and the principles of freedom and democracy have given way to double standards and censorship. And that's what they are trying to adopt and implement inside the country. The preparation of Moldova for NATO standards is prepared systematically. And here I operate with specific numbers and facts. According to recent polls, around 58% consider the destructive course pursued by the country's leadership to be wrong. And the number of supporters of the European integration in Moldova is decreasing. And neither the granting of the EU candidate status in 2022 helped, nor the announcement of the start of pre-accession negotiations. And the perspectives of rapprochement with the European Union are obviously dubious. Regarding the aggravation on the Armenian-Azerbaijan border, it's regarding the Sinug region in the Armenia and Azerbaijan. There was a number of armed incidents, and there are those killed and wounded. We call on Baku and Yerevan to exercise restraint, to carry out steps to de-escalate and to resolve disagreements by political, diplomatic means, and to adhere to the trilateral agreements at the highest level concluded from 2020 to 2022. We are convinced that territorial disputes should be resolved within the framework of the bilateral Armenian-Azerbaijani Boundary Delimitation Commission that provides consultative assistance to this process. On the 7th of February, we just witnessed another puppet show in Japan regarding the Day of Northern Territories. So it's just different from kabuki. It was not had no artistic value. It was just some official Japanese line, and there were demonstrations at Russian consular and diplomatic offices, so it's just what they accompany their actions with. It's hostile actions against Russia aimed at historical revisionism. It's Japan's slipping down to the dangerous path of blocking and supporting neo-Nazism, their claims to the southern Kuril Islands. We insist that Japan should recognize to the full extent the results of the Second World War and the petition adopted at the All-Japanese Rally to renew the negotiations on the peaceful treaty in southern Kurils. And it should be directed to the administration of Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. And the basis for bilateral ties should be created. I would like to say a few words about the parishes of Russian Orthodox Church in Denmark. So there's baseless claims against the Russian Patriarchate in Denmark. It was commented by the Russian ambassador in Denmark. We consider these publications as a purposeful campaign to discredit the activities of Orthodox parishes on the basis of religion or nationality. It was part of anti-Russian hysteria that engulfed Denmark and the West as a whole. This so-called witch hunt has already caused severe damage to multifaceted bilateral cooperation. Now these measures have reached the Orthodox parishes that are legally engaged in their activities on the territory of the kingdom. It's not just spiritual and humanitarian, but a unifying role, because the services are attended by people of different nationalities residing in this country. We continue to defend the rights of parishioners and the freedom of religion, and we will engage the potential of the relevant international organizations. And now a few words about the engaged, politicized, this issue of children by the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the UN body. On the 8th of February, the periodic reports, 6th and 7th periodic reports of the Russian Federation, those observations were published. We have to note that this body performed its duties in a non-professional and politicized manner. And the states should adhere to their obligations with regard to the international treaty, and our country is committed to strict compliance with international legal norms in this regard for 35 years now. The Convention on the Rights of the Child has been the main reference point for us, and that is why we have sent there the intergovernmental delegation, and they spent almost six hours to answer more than 100 questions on the rights of the child. However, as the analysis of concluding observations shows, the constructive dialogue with the committee did not take place. And the conclusions and estimations, they testify of the political bias, especially with regard to Russia's special military operation. And we have the impression that those recommendations were prepared beforehand and that defense was just a formality necessary for the existing rules of the game. A number of the concluding observations of the Committee on the Rights of the Child is deliberately negative, and another part it just has one-sided approach of the convention. So what is not in accordance with some reference point is just destroyed, and they are just lacking. They're just lacking basis, lacking proof, and the use of the unverified data from biased NGOs. Before the special military operation, the plight of the children in Donbass, and before 2014, they lived in danger. They died, and no one was interested. After 2022, the topic is raised exclusively in the context of Russian aggression, while casualties among children on the territory of our country and the airstrikes, they're just kept silent. They just do not mention from whose shells children die, and they just keep this silent.
One historical example that we have already cited, but I would like to speak about this in detail, and I will explain you why. Some time will elapse, but this world is made in this way. Not everything that is substantiated by the facts and not everything that is evident becomes the part of global shared information. It is not accepted as the truth. Some time should elapse before this. More than 90 years ago, our country has established an international school called Interdome. Back then, it became an orphanage for a great number of children whose parents were in prisons in states with fascist regimes. Do you think that this children establishment was set in 1933. What did they think of it in the West? What did they write about this? We will carry out this work. We will see this work through. We will give the quotations and evidence. The response was quite similar to the way that now Russia protects the rights of the child. The school was established in 1933 at the initiative of trade unions in Ivanovo with support of international organization to help the revolution fighters. The president, the head of this organization, was Yelena Stasova. This orphanage became the manifestation of internationalism and the goodwill of Soviet citizens towards children who lost their parents in Spain, in Africa and Latin America. The first orphans who were received in this orphanage were children from Germany, Greece, Austria, Bulgaria, Hungary, Italy, and many other states. What do you think? Someone in these states who now are involved in the work of international structures accusing Russia that many outstanding public figures were brought up by our country back then, 19 years ago. They not just saved them, but they helped them to make their career. We demonstrated that we could take care of someone else's children as we would care of our own. No, they do not remember this, but these children do remember. During the civil war in Spain, Spanish children were received in the orphanage Interdome. During the revolution in China, many Chinese children were received. The Ivanovo Interdome became a second home to them. No one was ever ashamed of this fact of their biography. Till the end of 1980s, children from conflict and war-ravaged countries were brought up there. Over the course of 91 years, the Interdom became a home to 5,000 international orphans. Interdom elaborated a system of very careful and delicate educational system. They were unwilling to adopt the child to our own culture. No one made them refuse from their motherland. They were preserving ties with their compatriots. The majority went back to their native lands, and at the same time they were preserving ties with the Russian Federation, with the school, with their friends. It is difficult to overestimate the role of Interdom in bringing up children in the spirit of mutual assistance, friendship. The graduates of this unique educational establishment managed to make a great career and to achieve success in very different avenues. Many of them received and adopted very prominent and high-standing positions. Let me quote some individual examples. Zaur Dahtem, an outstanding graduate of Interdom, made a brilliant career in cinema. He shot documentary and play films. He was the director of many important films in 1980s. He has the title of the Merited Culture Worker of Tajik Soviet Republic. He is also known in the Republic as a photographer who organizes multiple international exhibitions. The outstanding graduate of Interdom remembers his school even 65 years since the graduation. He even published a memory diary. One more graduate of Interdom, Aldo Canestri. He was a son of an Italian trade union public figure, communist Antonio Canestri. After graduation, he entered Moscow State University. He specialized in literature. Since 1962 until his death in 2014, he taught Italian in the Moscow State Pedagogical Institution of Foreign Languages. He brought up several generations of interpreters and specialists on the Italian language in Russia. He published a good number of textbooks, of dictionaries, including a unique Italian-Russian dictionary. The Dictionary of Synonyms and Antonyms of the Italian Language became his main work. Jumin, a daughter, Jude, she came to the Interdom during the Great Patriotic War. Later, she graduated from the Moscow Pedagogical Institution named after Lenin and came back to the China People's Republic, where she taught the Russian language. The graduate of the Ivanova Orphanage, Rosa Yubin, became the editor in the Russian edition China. The first issue was published in 1951. It was aimed at deepening understanding between the two states. Later in my life, I saw a good number of magazines, from very profound ones to not such serious ones, and I would like to say that this very magazine, to my mind, is one of the best magazines which can inform while bringing people together, which can educate while preserving the freedom of opinion. It is a spectacular edition. You can look it through in libraries and in archives. One more graduate, the son of Bulgarian revolution fighters, Alexander Korostianov. He was a member of the defensive operation of Smolensk. He was awarded a medal for the merits in combat. In 1944, he became a captain of the Red Army and went back to Bulgaria. He was the head of a united group. He received the title of Major General. He served as a military attaché in Hungary and Vietnam. At the 50th anniversary of Interdom in 1983, he paid a visit to Ivanova together with other Bulgarian graduates. All the graduates of Ivanova orphanage still preserve ties with our country, and they make considerable contribution to the relations and to cooperation with our states. Everyone who is willing to do so can get familiar with archive photos and get familiar with the digital exposition published on our website. To mark the 90th anniversary of Interdom, the archive black and white pictures were digitalized. They are now in color. This work was carried out, and I do recommend that you look through this digital exposition. Every photo in this family photo album makes you feel the warmth and the joy of Interdom. This refers to the historical roots of attitude to children in our states, to the children who, due to the conflicts in their own states, happen to live without families. We have historical evidence how Russia treated and still treats such situations. Does this historical evidence exist in the countries accusing us? Let them demonstrate this evidence, and we will see. This is their statement. This is the Western statement. You can do this because you used to do so in the past. Yes, we did so. We helped children who were left in their own states without parents, and their parents fell victims to Nazi and fascist regimes. It was not only the matter of survival, it was the matter of preserving humanity and to come back to their states, preserving their language, their culture, and the love of their motherland. At the same time, they received additional knowledge. Russia was very generous in sharing its knowledge with these children. One more issue to discuss, closely connected with what we all are doing now and what people used to do. There is a wave of coming out as to the Nazi German origin. We understand why the government of Olaf Scholz sponsors the neo-Nazi regime of Zelensky, because the members of this government, many of them, are from the Nazi background. They never stated that they deny or condemn the activities of their predecessors. This all happens against the backdrop of the implementation of the many research institutions of Germany, together with the Institution of Modern History, Munich, Berlin, to publish public speeches and statements made by Adolf Hitler over the period of 1933-1945. Those who made this initiative, they suggest that a volume in text and audio version is published, which will be available for public, including school children. Of course, the school children should understand the essence of the ideology of Olaf Scholz policy. We have an impression that the integration of the artistic heritage of Adolf Hitler has become an industry. I will give an evidence, I will give you a proof since the 1990s, 30 years ago. In the same way, 17 volumes of orders and statements of Adolf Hitler were published over the period of 1925 to 1933, as well as the 2-volume edition Hitler Mein Kampf. Since it was first published in 2016, it was republished 12 times. Just think about it. Instead of condemning everything that has something to do with the criminal heritage, with the most heinous personality in the history of humanity, modern Germany, with the consent of its authorities, publishes statements of its leader to bring enlightenment in education. This is nothing but the aspiration of German authorities to take revenge for the defeat of the Third Reich. They are now obsessed with this idea, and now they are deliberately blurring the crimes of the German history. This is traditionally reaffirmed by the attitude of Germany to the traditional resolution proposed to the General Assembly of the United Nations on glorification of the Nazism. For a long time, Germany abstained from voting, and since 2022, it votes against the resolution. I have a natural question to the German people. What will come next? Do you understand what you have to expect from yourselves? What will you do next? Will you recognize the merits of Adolf Hitler as an outstanding public figure, or something of this kind? For me, this is the main material, not for today's briefing, but for the recent years. I have just told you about Germany publishing books dedicated to statements and public speeches of Adolf Hitler, not dedicated to the critical analysis of his speeches and statements, but this is the first source which is published. Perhaps Germany should publish a book on genocide of the Soviet people during World War II. Perhaps Germany should publish, just to complement its efforts, to complement the efforts of every edition and re-edition of program speeches pronounced by Hitler, to publish books, brochures, and materials. What was done by Hitler to the peoples of the Soviet Union. Perhaps those who are in the anti-fascist way, they will think of it and will speak up with an initiative. I will give you a detailed material in this regard. Unfortunately, we see that many politicians, public figures, first and foremost from Western states, they are silencing the atrocities committed against the peoples of the USSR during the Great Patriotic War and during World War II. Some of them attributes the suffering of millions of people to only one people. They prevent everyone from considering oneself a victim. Some others are proud of their historical and heroic predecessors, as it is the case with Annalena Baerbock. Bild published a number of such personalities. They are not merely accomplices. They were representatives of the Third Reich, and they were Nazis. Others, such as Canadian authorities, cannot refoul Nazi criminals. They substantiate their position by the lack of the extradition treaty between our states. The fact that this promotes and encourages neo-Nazis in Ukraine and in the Baltic states, this subject is mentioned during our briefings. All these public figures do not take notice of the sacrifice of the USSR, of the people of USSR during the Great Patriotic War. They forget completely about dozens and tens of millions of maimed lives and families, if they are alive, of their relatives. Especially for those who do not know, who is not aware of this, I will cite the facts so that you cannot say later that you did not know, you had no access to information. Of course, within our briefing, it is just impossible to imagine the scale of the tragedy, but I will give you some numbers. According to the Prosecutor's General Office, since July 1949 to August 1944, during the occupation of the Soviet territory, German Nazi invaders and their accomplices, while using punishing campaigns, exterminated 7.3 billion people, including 18,000 children. Almost 2 billion of Soviet citizens were enslaved. The siege of Leningrad, which lasted for 872 days, claimed lives of 1,093,000 people, half of the city's population. The tragedy of the enemy occupation affected almost 80 millions of people in the USSR. 13 millions and even more were killed by fascists, where they were enslaved or starved to death. When talking to Vice Prime Minister of Romania in November 1949, Hitler clearly announced his plans to carry out genocide of the Slavic population. It was his overt goal. It should be known to everyone, because against the backdrop of other political statements, the true goals, the true objectives of the Nazis can now be buried, literally. They will pretend that it wasn't the case, but it did happen. These are the plans of Hitler as of November 1949. The future Europe should comprise only two races, the Latin one and the German one. These are the words pronounced by Hitler. These two races should work together in Russia to exterminate the Slavic population. I end quote. One more quotation from the very same document. The Slavic issue, as to Hitler, is of biological, not ideological character, as you said. This is his direct quote, I repeat this. And the fight against the Slavic population should be carried out by the European population in general. My mission is, if I succeed, is the following: to exterminate the Slavic population. The end of quote. One more very telling fact. The guidelines of the Navy as of November the 29th, 1949. These are the words of Hitler as to Leningrad. This war, which is being waged for the right of existence, we are not interested in preserving even a small part of the population.
We have documentary evidence of deliberate, pre-planned extermination of civilians and prisoners of war by military leadership of Nazi Germany, and to destroy the statehood of the Soviet Union in order to further colonize them and for their further exploitation, in order to expand, to form the living space, so-called living space of the German nation. And what Adolf Hitler said on the 16th of July 1941 during his meeting with the leaders of the Reich. So, quote, "The creation of a military power west of the Urals must never again be on the agenda, even if we have to fight 100 years for it. The whole of the Baltic states should become a province of the empire, and likewise Crimea with its neighboring areas should be part of the empire, the Volga colonies and the Baku region. To exterminate Leningrad in order to give it to the Finns further. And very important is undoubtedly Ukraine," unquote. It was a quote. According to Walter Wallimont, what he said at Nuremberg on the 13th of November 1945, it's a quotation. Germany was intended to extend its living space far to the east. For this purpose, new military frontiers should appear beyond the Caucasus, and then on the western coast of the Caspian Sea as far as Astrakhan, and then along the Volga upwards, then from the upper reaches of the Volga towards Arkhangelsk. The task of extermination was set by the German leadership long before the war. It was reflected in various decrees. According to the Ost master plan, we mention very often one of the main means of the liberation of the occupied territories from the indigenous population were death camps. So Directive number 21, it was the Barbarossa plan of the 13th March 1941. On the application of the military jurisdiction in the of Barbarossa on special measures for troops, signed by William Keitel and others. They elevated the atrocities against civilians to the rank of state policy and freed the Nazi soldiers from responsibility for their crimes. On the 30th of March 1941, Hitler made a speech for his high-ranking officers. Quote, he called the destruction of Bolshevik commissars and Bolshevik intellectuals necessary, end of quote. The directive of the Supreme Command of the German Armed Forces of 12 of May 1941 ordered to destroy captured political workers from the employees of Soviet state, communal and economic institutions that were declared especially dangerous for the implementation of plans to colonize the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union political workers were to be considered prisoners of war. And that directive on the region of Barbarossa, it said that the use against Wehrmacht soldiers would not be mandatory, even if it is a war crime or misdemeanor. And the mass violent measures should be taken if the obstacles do not allow to find the specific perpetrators in Khatin. That was how the crime was committed. With the order of the 23rd of May 1941 on the conduct of troops in Russia, the military command of Nazi Germany called on the troops to merciless and energetic struggle against Bolshevik instigators, resisting saboteurs and Jews, in order to suppress any active or passive resistance. Mass shootings of civilians, concentration camps, villages burned down with their inhabitants inside. Those were the daily routine activities of the German occupational regime. Hermann Göring, the Göring whose rifle was held lovingly by the first president of Ukraine, saying that he will use it because it was the rifle of Göring, the right hand of Hitler. According to the order by Göring, a plan was elaborated to exploit the territories in the east. Its results would be death from hunger of millions of people of the Slavic population, mass death of prisoners, expropriation in favor of Germany of food in the occupied territories. According to the German plan of fighting hunger, Herbert Backe, State Secretary of the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, the armed forces were to be fully supplied with the resources of the Soviet Union without taking into account the needs of the Soviet population, of course. So, according to the Ost plan, the Nazis sought to demographically reorganize Europe in order for Russian territories to be able to provide food for the occupied Europe. In Wavelsburg, Heinrich Himmler set as the aim the reduction of the Slavic population by 30 million people. It was testified by Erich von den Bach-Zelewski in Nuremberg in 1946. In November 1941, Heinrich Göring shared with Italian Foreign Minister Ghelazzo Ciano that within the next year, 20 to 30 million people will die of starvation in Russia. And that would be a good thing, because some peoples must be substantially reduced. End of quote. Hitler also predicted a, quote, national catastrophe for the Muscovites, and predicting that millions of people will die of starvation in many Soviet regions. During 1941, Joseph Goebbels stated that Russia has nothing to expect from occupied Eastern territories. Alfred Rosenberg also stated that the starvation of millions of people was quote, a cruel necessity that is not to be sympathized with, end of quote. Now you know that it's a substitute for Holodomor in Ukraine. the desire to keep such channels. Australia keeps imposing sanctions on Russia, and is there any contradictions? Are there any contradictions between declarations of the officials Sydney and their actions? I have already mentioned that the essence remains the same. I do not see any contradictions. They just follow their policy, but they understand that there will be a reciprocation. And if there was no reciprocation, they would have gone in that Russophobia up to the end. Is Sputnik with us? Yes, hello, Madam Zakharova. We have one question. It will be the 35th anniversary of the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan. Could the situation develop in a different manner, and whose interests were decisive in the conflict in the country? So there are many points of view from historians, from participants in those events. They have written many memoirs, monographies, and all that is published and expressed by scientific community as conclusions, opinions. So I offer not only to get our reaction, but to read the mentioned authors. So partly I have already provided comments in replying in my introductory part. And what I can say, anyway, the Soviet Union provided enormous assistance to Afghanistan by laying the foundation primarily of its economy. I have mentioned it, citing facts, figures, and we will provide reference in the text of the briefing to the materials that testify, that have specific facts on this, our position. Do you have any other questions? No, thank you. Is the Moscow Post with us? Yes, hello, we have 3 questions today. The first of them, former US President Donald Trump said that Joe Biden may have time to unleash the Second World War before the end of his presidential term. Such statements sound threatening not only for Americans. How can you comment on this? Well, I agree with you totally that such things should be considered as electoral rhetorics, and it should be understood what elections in election in the U.S. Its nature of specific show. But if we add up all bloody conflicts supported by the U.S. within the last decades, and the role of the American Democratic Party and the conservative movement, it can be compared with the global conflict, with victims, with the suffering of civilians, with destruction of statehood of countries. If that is analyzed in total, behind what is the United States and the elites, and supported by the White House, so it can be compared to the global conflict, I think. Thank you. Next question. Deputy Foreign Minister Galuzin explained to the Israeli ambassador to Moscow the principled approaches of the Russian side to the Ukrainian crisis. Can you tell how the Russian Foreign Ministry assesses Israel's policy towards Ukraine? So could you repeat your question? I have not heard the last part. There is no sound. Can you tell how the Russian Foreign Ministry assesses Israel's policy towards Ukraine? what is clearly at odds with Russia's interests. Well, it's said that the Israeli representatives, the representatives of the political establishment, do not perceive correctly the causes and results of what is happening now in Ukraine. Now and within the last decades, we regularly use our bilateral contacts in order to convey to Israel, with the respect for its sovereignty, its right to determine its foreign policy, also with regard to the Ukrainian crisis, and the regular bilateral contacts are used for that purpose as well. Our position on that, on the Ukrainian issue, is clear. It has a facts basis. It's not it's permanent, and we use our contacts with Israeli colleagues via diplomatic channels and through civil society. But we still have to explain, because the Israeli leadership, political forces do not understand that the situation in Ukraine, formed for many years, has a directly connected to the Second World War, and the reincarnation on the territory of modern Ukraine. And Israel should be aware of that more than anyone else. And my last question: on Friday, it's the start of the Munich Conference on Security without the participation of Russian representatives. What's the assessment of the Russian Foreign Ministry and its expectations? Well, we have observed the continuous degradation of the Munich platform, and I think that today we will publish an extensive material on the retrospectives, citations from our representative speeches. I remember those crisis events when only one party started to dominate at the Munich conference, the United States of America. However, I would like to remind that in its name itself, it's pointed out that it's about security on the European continent. And it was just strange to observe that the United States were dictating the agenda and dictating the conclusions of the conference. It was literally like that. I very well remember the situation in Ukraine developing in 2013-2014, being ridiculed by the participants of those conference. That was the case. And that all degraded for quite a long period. And we did everything to return this discussion into political sphere. But we have quite a lot of alternative platforms in our country and abroad where we take part at different levels. There is a good alternative to what is now unable to act. And today we will post a material with historic quotations how to prevent this fall into an abyss. So is news.ru with us? Hello, Madam Zakharova. My first question. You have mentioned the aggravation at the Armenian-Azerbaijani border, and what are the measures taken by Moscow in order to resolve those disagreements between Baku and Yerevan, And why? What are the reasons of this escalation? Because Yerevan has admitted Karabakh as part, recognized Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan. Well, I have already provided comments and I have nothing to add to that. So thank you. The second question now. The Russian ambassador in Azerbaijan, Mikhail Yevdokimov, reported the negotiations on the future of Russian peacekeepers in Karabakh. So what is the situation in this regard now? The preparation is underway of the next Russian-Azerbaijani context in this sphere. Our dialogue in this field is regular and constructive. Among the issues under discussion are the prospects of the return of the Armenian population to Karabakh, common security and security of historical and religious heritage. We also have a question about our so-called partners. How can you comment on Donald Trump's call on NATO to raise spending on aid to Ukraine? And does it mean that Trump intends to continue military action in Ukraine, or he tries to somehow end those hostilities? So I think that American voters should study this situation, and it's really sad that it's nearly impossible to do that. Within the latest years, there have been many promises, many statements by candidates in order for the Americans, dead or alive, to vote for them. And if you then compare their actions with their aims, you just could see a significant difference. In this situation, you just need to understand that it's about the situation before the elections, and it's not important whether the candidate performs its obligations, its promises, meets its promises. It's just the atmosphere of American election. Other things are not significant, but that's the American voters who should study the situation. So to raise NATO spending on Ukraine, is there some real? So just to remind of some fairy tale myths or some Eastern stories about some slave being made to sell everything, just everything, when nothing remains, no house, no food, but still there are demands to sacrifice. So when nothing remains, the partners of the US in NATO have nothing left. Maybe if they put pressure on Great Britain, and some diamond egg will be taken from the Buckingham Palace. So just not about specific spending, specific sums allocated by the EU countries as aid to the Kiev regime. It's just promises. What they are made to contribute by the US, it does not seem possible now. They will just be destroyed by that. But it should be not just be a check. It should be supported by something. But there is no such case. And I absolutely agree with you that it characterizes the policy of the US. That is about not paying attention to their partners' interests. Partners in NATO, the EU countries, in order to economically destroy them. to eliminate their competitor, taking into account those monstrous economic figures, financial figures that characterize the current situation in the American domestic and foreign policy, economy, and so on. Thank you very much. Thank you. Is China Media Corporation with us? Yes, hello, Madam Zakharova. We have 2 questions today. It's frozen assets of Russia used for Ukraine. Those holding more than 1 million euro assets should be accumulated as a result of EU restrictive measures, and what will be the Russian response to that? So I have not heard anything from your question. Could you speak more slowly and maybe more distinctly, because the connection was very bad. Well, I will repeat the question again. The EU has approved a regulation that would provide a legal base for the frozen assets, use of Russian frozen assets for Ukraine. What would be countermeasures by Russia? If you mean the 12th February decision, the EU declared the normative acts, formally announced their intentions to put into special accounts the profits from Russian sovereign assets, and this step will open a way, pave the way for further measures by the EU, maybe to support the Zelensky regime and to prolong the Ukrainian conflict. Our position remains unchanged. We qualify that as theft. Any actions by the EU to freeze, to potentially confiscate the possessions, the assets of our legal persons, of our people, will be a violation of the current agreements. And we have many times stated that the theft by the European Union of Russian assets can literally open the Pandora box. And for those purposes, the European Union is just ready to rewrite its own laws, and it's just another factor of contradiction to the domestic EU legislation. So the theft of Russian assets, the responsibility will be borne by the EU itself and its political leadership. Russia has the right to adopt response measures in order to protect its legal, lawful interests, and the long-term detriment to the European Union itself. If the assets owned by Russia are stolen, it will be much more than the immediate profit. Unprecedented inflation, energy deficit, decrease in profits of citizens. We observe all that, and Germany, that used to be a driving force of the European economy, it has been plunged into the economic crisis. The Russian economy has compensated an insignificant decrease of 2022. It continues its growth, and we just warn the EU leadership against the violation of legislation, and we have our legislation in order to form the adequate reply. and their reputation will be a significant and irreparable harm for that. Just a safe harbor for those who flee. It's and to follow is the immigration of foreign capitals from the European Union, because everyone will understand that any time Brussels will be able to steal them, and the government of the European Union.
Всё или есть еще?
Is this all, or you have some more questions? I apologize, but I cannot hear you well. We have one more question. On February the 12th, about one more event that took place on February the 12th. On this very day, Israeli aviation attacked a city in the south of the Gaza Strip. Several hours later, Josep Borrell stated that the authorities should stop to beg it to stop killing Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and to launch concrete activities to limit arms deliveries. For instance, Joe Biden stated that the United States and its partners are working in close coordination and trying to elaborate a pause, a truce for 6 weeks. Anthony Blinken, even earlier, he mentioned the position of the Middle East states. I apologize for the sound. I hope that you heard at least something. Speaking briefly, you would like to know the evaluations of the Russian efforts on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict settlement. In order to evaluate the efforts of the United States to regulate the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, we should see at least any results. So now we see anti-results, which testifies to the incapability of the United States of America to have responsibility for this region and for international conflicts in general, where they believe to have the right to moderate. One more time, we reaffirm the need to consolidate international efforts in the interests of the urgent regulation of the unprecedented crisis in the zone of Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Let me remind you that tens of thousands of people died as a result of this conflict. The overwhelming majority are the civilians of the Gaza Strip, many women and many children, more than half of the total amount. We are deeply preoccupied by the statements made by Israel to upscale the military operation. This will trigger a humanitarian disaster. More than 1 million of Gaza Strip civilians will be targeted because they fled to this city bordering with Egypt to save themselves from the conflict. We seek to stop the bloodshed and to guarantee conducive environment for humanitarian assistance in the enclave. Russia has repeatedly stated that without political solution to the Middle East settlement, no lasting solution will be possible. Having overcome the acute phase of the crisis, we should renew the political dialogue between the Palestinians and Israelis, which would be aimed at a comprehensive solution of all differences in the framework of international legislation defined by the UN Security Council and the UN itself. The result of this negotiating process should be the independent Palestinian state in the borders of 1979, in coexisting in peace and security with Israel. Our experience demonstrates that there is no reasonable alternative to this approach. Thank you very much. Reuters, are you with us? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. We have 2 questions. One question to follow the one asked by my colleague from the China Media Corporation, Russia's response in case the European Union uses frozen Russian assets. How will Russia respond? You say that Russia powerfully uses its own legislation. Will you seize the assets of the European Union, which are now under control of the Russian authorities when foreign investors leave, or will some other measures will be implemented or introduced? I understand very well that you would like to know more detail, but we can respond only to concrete actions. Now this decision was adopted. That is why the government is analyzing a series of possible options how to respond to hostile activities carried out by non-friendly states as to the seizure of assets. We are working through a mirror response when Russia is deprived of its accumulated reserves. You understand very well that this work is being carried out not under cameras or not before microphones. We have made clear our principled position, and we will respond in line with the actions undertaken by Brussels. Just imagine if they are happy before time in advance, it won't be right. My second question. Our sources say that Russia, over the course of the year 2023, several times through unofficial channels, through intermediaries, sent signals to the United States that it was ready to achieve truce in the Ukrainian conflict. However, the United States refused from these signals repeatedly also. Can you say, did these contacts have place? If so, how did the United States substantiate their refusal from the Russian peaceful initiatives? I believe that today you heard the response to a similar question made by Foreign Minister Lavrov when he spoke at the State Duma. First, he denied this information. He debunked this information. I believe that this is an interpretation of the information we gave during our negotiations. What are the conditions for such negotiations? Why they are not in place now? I believe that this is an incorrect interpretation of the facts and misrepresentation of the facts. I wouldn't like to refer to this as the prospects of peace settlement. We have underscored that the negotiations with the Kiev regime were in place when the Kiev regime requested to hold such negotiations in 2022. First, they were suspended by Great Britain after Boris Johnson paid a visit to Ukraine, and later on a legislation level, this ban on negotiations was enshrined by the United States. It was not us who suspended the negotiations. We responded to Ukrainian initiatives. This was it. Due to the pressure exercised over Zelensky and over the Kiev regime by the West, we responded several times to the questions such as what should we do to resume negotiations. The West should unblock their own solution. They should lift their own ban prohibiting to hold negotiations with Russia for the Kiev regime. I believe that these are rumors, these are interpretations. I do not know what this is, but I do not know why some conspiracy theories are being built. Our position is overt and clear. President Putin, Foreign Minister Lavrov, all representatives of our government who are in charge of making public statements in this regard, they have emphasized this point. They gave very detailed and very concrete answers to these questions. Why should we invent some other interpretations to an open and adequate Russian position? But if you have more detail in your sources, I would like to understand, I would like to figure out what you are speaking about. I do not know. Even not given the names of the sources, just tell me what they mean, just give more detail. There is nothing to comment, as you put it. Thank you. Radio Saga, are you with us? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. Radio Saga, Iceland. Can you hear me? Yes, I can hear you. Good afternoon. I would like you to congratulate on the belated Diplomatic Workers' Day. Thank you for the event you organized on Saturday, on February the 10th. It was a pleasure to come. This week, news agencies said that in Mariupol, some findings were made. There is a suspension that big pharmaceutical companies of the West used the services of corrupt officials of the Ukrainian Public Health Ministry. They conducted medical experiments on the people. Could you make a comment in this regard? Will this situation be publicly announced on the international level? We did see these messages. The information is shocking. We are verifying the facts. I do not want to say anything before we have the evaluation of experts and the opinion of experts to make sure that no one says that we speculate on unverified facts. We have repeatedly mentioned American biological laboratories around the world, and we said that the whole territory of Ukraine was used for Western experiments. I mean, medication, biological agents and arms which are being tested on the Ukrainian armed forces and those who they are fighting, which was not previously tested. One more time, let us wait the official verification procedure, but I won't be surprised if this information is true and if it will be verified. Anadolu, are you with us? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. We have 3 questions today. My first question: despite the solution of the international court to prevent the risk of genocide, the Israeli army pursues military action, killing civilians. What do you think about the Israeli action that go contrary with the international solutions? I have just made a comment in this regard in the context of the situation in Rafah, which is discussed all over the world. The Russian Foreign Ministry has repeatedly called upon the respect of international obligations. The respect of these obligations should result in the conflict resolution and the conflict settlement. This is why we put a focus on the international legal framework. Thank you very much. My second question: the election winner in Finland said that the increasing of the level of relations with Russia cannot be expected before the special military operation ends. How would you respond? We have voiced our position as to the bilateral relations with Finland due to the hostile policy carried out by the Finland. Our friendly ties were severed. The accumulated potential of bilateral cooperation was demolished. We see repeating anti-Russian, Russophobe statements. This was truly reaffirmed during the pre-election campaign when all candidates to the position of the head of the Finnish state were competing in aggression, or so to say, the level of anti-Russian attitude. We expect nothing from coming out of this bilateral crisis. My last question. Can you comment on the statement made by the Armenian Prime Minister Nicola Pashinyan in his interview to the Daily Telegraph? She said that Armenia can participate in military blocs, including Organization of the Treaty of Security and Cooperation, and evaded answering to the question of the possible arrest of Vladimir Putin. I spoke about this in detail on February the 7th, speaking about the last part of your question. I can only say that when Armenia joined the International Criminal Court and this damages our bilateral relations, this makes Armenia to make a choice between the International Court obligations and anti-Russia and the cooperation with Russia and Eurasian integration. We hope to receive reassurances from Yerevan. Thank you very much. 92 News Pakistan, are you with us?
I am Shahid Guman, correspondent 92 News Pakistan. Recent general election in Pakistan is being discussed all over the world with accusation of rigging and irregularities. How does the Russia see this situation?
We were following closely the elections that took place. The Russian observers that were present there, the general elections took place. The authorities managed to guarantee the expression of the free will of citizens despite terrorist threats and a complicated internal situation. We believe that the government will be formed as soon as possible. Thank you too. Big Asia, are you with us? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. The interview that was published on January the 9th, which was given by President Putin to Tucker Carlson, dwelt on BRICS and relations with China. Leading mass media sources made their commentaries reflecting official statements of some political leaders. At the same time, we have very little information as to how common people perceived this information. Can you please share how people in Asia responded to the interview? Thank you very much. You know what is the matter? You are asking me a question in a similar format that we have in the West. You ask me, as a person who represents a state agency, to say how people abroad respond to the interview. You can find this information by yourself, given that all people voice their opinion in social media. All social media now have the function of instantaneous translation. You can figure it out independently so that we do not play in these so-called Western games where censorship is employed. When we speak instead of people, people have already voiced their opinion. We can understand it from the number of views. They were surprised to learn that they are banned from viewing something for no apparent reason. There is no age limitation. There is no information contradicting the legislation. Simply just because a person in the State Department or in the White House decided that this content should not be better viewed. Everyone was shocked by this approach. The interview given by President Putin voiced our strategic line. It was expressed many times during press conferences, during his meetings with journalists, and so on and so forth. We are completely shocked that the Western world was not prepared for what followed, that people would see it, that they would ask questions, that they would listen to it, it is as if we were going to prevent the wind from blowing. It was a miscalculation. They only increased the number of views on different platforms because you understand, when you tell someone, don't view this, don't watch this, and they make no arguments besides their aggression and their hatred, of course everyone will watch this interview. It is not a difficult thing to do. It would be a good thing to do, perhaps to publish a commentary with some excerpts from the evaluations from the mass media of the region that you mentioned, which are the most representative ones from our point of view. Thank you very much. We are moving forward. Голос Отечества, are you with us? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. We have 3 questions today.
What is the threat of the disruption in relations with the West? We have many connections, but please, I beg you, tide is just some other genre. We have contacts, but we are not tied, and it's not we who are breaking those ties. They have isolated themselves from us with a wire, with information blockade. But we're not breaking those ties, those contacts, those relations with them. So it's a mistake. You are right. Our text was different with regard to those ties, technologies, banking systems, and communications, mobile communications. What will we lose, actually? I would like to quote the International Monetary Fund data. It cannot be accused of supporting Russia. I cannot say it's entirely objective data, but that's the data that the Westerners operate. Russia's GDP growth in 2023 reached 3%. According to Russian estimates, that was 3.6%. And the Western economies, their growth did not exceed 1.6%. So those initiators of anti-Russian measures, they just miscalculated. They got the reverse negative effect. So it's just a prolonged crisis. The industrial sector and especially energy spheres, the European products lose their competitiveness, so they just hate China now. That is a competitor for them. The tendency of bankruptcy of enterprises is intensifying. There is a problem of shortage of skilled labor, budget deficit, and the level of inflation. And you have identified the problem correctly. Internationally, we put an emphasis on developing cooperative-friendly ties with the countries that have a historical experience of business. It's Asia-Pacific region, the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa. We have actively shifting towards the use of national currencies, de-dollarization, and creating the payment mechanisms independent of the West. The substitution program is being effectively implemented. And you can see all this at the International Exhibition Russia Forum. you can see the best achievements of the recent years published by our government by the end of 2023, the beginning of 2024. But it does not mean we have initiated all that, the end of conflict, the end of contacts. We have repeatedly stated the need for preservation of the things gained for the recent years, but when our national interests are violated, no compromise was possible, and we tried to find to resolve the situation with our own bonuses. Next question: the position of Russia that is often expressed in many statements is that the Kiev regime is at war with Russia and supported by the West. But you can observe more and more often that the situation is the reverse, actually, as the West is at war with Russia, using Ukraine as a territory, as cannon fodder to harm Russia. And the Ukrainians are often victims and often not even given their names in battle. And NATO weapons are shipped not only to Ukraine but to neighboring countries. And President Lukashenko said that there is one fatherland divided into several parts. And from this point of view, the activities of NATO on those territories can be named intervention. And can the foreign ministry position be corrected with regard to that? Our foreign policy concept, it just clearly states the direction of our development. We consider Russia as one of the leading centers of the development of the modern world, considering its independent foreign policy as a threat to Western hegemony, and as with a pretext, they have started the war of hybrid type, aimed at undermining the positions of Russia, its technological capabilities, limiting its sovereignty in foreign and domestic policy, and harming its territorial integrity. This policy was adopted at the state level, and you can see the description of the essence of what you have spoken about, and in the main body of the concept, our measures to counter that are described. And regarding the words of President Putin, that our fight for sovereignty is of a liberative nature, you have confirmed that it's the official policy of Russia. We would like to continue these logics, and we would ask your opinion on the interview of President Putin to a foreign journalist. And several new ideas were expressed by President Putin there. He said that former Russian leadership stemmed from the fact that the Soviet Union ceased to exist. So today, do we stem from the fact that the Soviet Union ceased to exist? And if so, what will be the restoration of measures for the restoration of the multinational Russian people? So let us just divide that into parts. Russia is an heir to the Soviet Union, and that's the reply to your question. If you saw in the interview by Russian president passages of interest to you, you might address the president's press service or the administration, taking into account it's on such ideological and the whole complex of, so to say, most important major foreign policy issues. And on what you have formed as when we will start the reunification of peoples, whether it can be named as a reunification or reunifying agenda for people. We're in charge of compatriots. We have been in charge of compatriots for a long time. From the first day after the events that took place, but the speed, the forms were different due to objective, sometimes non-objective reasons. On the work with compatriots, you are regularly informed that supporting compatriots culture, education cluster, programs for the moving of compatriots. And with regard to global violations of the rights of Russian citizens residing abroad, our compatriots, a whole range of measures, and primarily the measures taken at the legislative level, and the work is conducted daily. Thank you. Thank you. Is Verelk with us? Yes, hello, Madam Zakharova. We have 3 questions. So the first question is regarding again with the interview of a Russian ambassador in Azerbaijan, because there were formulations that caused vivid reaction in Armenia. Could you speak more loudly? Yes, we would like to understand what terrorists he means, because the territory, it was in charge of the Russian peacekeepers. And what terrorists does he mean, and what terrorists does? And those were the statements by Sergey Lavrov and Sergey Narishkin in 2020 about thousands of militants of terrorist groups being shifted there. Regarding the Armenia-Azerbaijan normalization, you should first of all take into account the assessments of the Russian Foreign Ministry, the minister. They are provided, I think, daily on our website through our briefings. It would be great if, as you are now citing the interview of our ambassador in Azerbaijan, of what Sergey Lavrov, what statements he makes, and what is published on our web portal, social media accounts. Many materials are, so to say, invisible, seem to be invisible by the whole range of media in media outlets in Armenia. What we say, positive, constructive, cite facts, cooperation figures. We spoke about economic cooperation with Armenia, but there is no interest. But there was a lot of data, a lot of figures. But what Armenian media outlets cited that? Why? It does not provoke any questions, but these are facts. That's the truth, what reflects the situation, the current situation. And the estimations, certain phrases, they are viewed through some biased approach. And objectiveness to your assessment should be added, I think. Not to take the phrases out of the context. And if they are taken out of the context, let us regard them with greater attention. So regarding the Russian peacekeepers, the Russian military contingent for these years has performed the functions laid on it. It was the Russian peacekeepers that achieved peace between the parties and provided a lot of aid to the population in the region. If you have not noticed where the terrorists are now, maybe the peacekeepers have performed their functions not badly, and thank God they are not heard, they are not seen. And should stop playing words. It's just for everyone. You should pay more attention to words. When you read the media outlets, unfortunately sponsored, we know, and you know that very well, people directly connected with official government authorities in Yerevan. And so they get money directly from people affiliated with the current authorities in Armenia. Is their task to worsen the relations of our people? We should look for the root causes there, and not where you are looking for them, where our media outlets are objective. So let me also have my point of view on this issue. I have the right for that. You have sent me materials, and I am ready to send you materials. In a derogatory, in a fake form, Russian approaches are treated there to regional policy, bilateral relations, and you are well aware of what I am talking about. I will not advertise those media outlets, but we know very well who finances them. And that should also be mentioned, I think. And that should not be the outcome. We are interested in bilateral relations that would be mutually beneficial for the peoples of the two countries. We are interested in that. I have cited specific facts for you. And unfortunately, those specific facts do not have such feedback as the positive dynamic in bilateral relations, as the feedback caused by some differences in positions. They are artificially looked for. Do you have any other questions, Madam Zakharova? My second question is also connected with this interview. The ambassador estimated positively the approaches of the Azerbaijani side, but we would like to understand whether the territories seized by the Republic of Armenia in 2021-2022, allegedly, for the corridor to be provided. However, during the press conference, Sergey Lavrov mentioned that there should be no extraterritorial corridor. And we would like to understand the position of Russian ambassador. So the special representative Igor Khavaev is currently in Baku, and he has some planned contacts with local representatives, local officials, and he will be able to visit Yerevan as well in a friendly, in a partnership manner, to discuss all the details in order for those contacts to be actually implemented for the settlement. And my last question.
During the recent briefing, I asked you about vandalism and demolition of memorials to the heroes of the Great Patriotic War. I sent you some video materials. Over the course of this time, we received some information on the demolition of one more memorial. I would like to learn your opinion in this regard. We appreciate the efforts of everyone who is sending video materials depicting demolition of the Great Patriotic War memorials dedicated to the armed forces of the Soviet Union, to Soviet soldiers. Sometimes it refers to memorial complexes. We closely and thoroughly analyze all the materials you send. When there is even a slightest hint at the desecration of memorials dedicated to the Great Patriotic War, I mean any desecration, no matter where and when they take place, despite of the level of our economic and trade cooperation. Third, speaking about Baku and Yerevan reconciliation, we call upon all the sides to treat gently the historical and cultural heritage, not to wage a war against memorials in the context of our relations. These are some individual cases. As a general rule, we treat very carefully, with great attention and care, the memorials of the Great Patriotic War. We should create the environment for establishing conditions of mutual trust and mutual confidence. Without all these premises, the peace in the South Caucasus won't be achieved. We will discuss all the materials you send with the representatives of Azerbaijan in our bilateral contacts. Thank you. We are moving forward. The Russian vector, the Russian strategic vector. Are you with us? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. We have several questions. Vladimir Vinokurov, in his interview to RIA Novosti, said that the dismantlement of the Warsaw Treaty Organization resulted into NATO expansion and to the collective West deterrent politics, based on the strategy Anaconda Loop. The Anaconda Loop plan is now implemented. The military bases of NATO are moving closer to Russian borders. They represent a potential threat to the military security of the Russian Federation. What steps does the Ministry of Foreign Affairs implement to slow down or stop this process? We have repeatedly made commentaries on this question. NATO expansion is one of the key reasons for the current crisis of European security. Instead of being a uniting mechanism for shared European cooperation, which would ensure the lasting peace between the United States and Russia, they opted for a strategy of extending the zone of the Western dominance. As a result, they moved closer to our borders. Our initiatives are aimed at fighting real challenges. They were not considered by the NATO members. The latest attempt was made in December 2029, but our initiative was denied. As part of our political and diplomatic efforts, we provide consultations, we give explanations, we communicate this information to the global community. The correspondent measures to guarantee security are undertaken by the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. Speaking about the statements made by the NATO and the European Union, who are the subjects of the NATO, what did they say? They said that everything would be determined on the battlefield. Challenge accepted. Thank you very much. We have one more question regarding Japan. Is a peace treaty with is a peace agreement with Japan possible without any concessions made by Russia? During my previous briefing, I quoted the statements made in 2022. In this statement, we emphasized that after we launched the special military operation, the acting administration joined a non-friendly course towards our country. We see multiplying illegitimate sanctions. The Japanese community faces belligerent sentiment. The eastern border sees military activity escalation involving Japan. material equipment is sent to the Kiev regime, leave alone the political assistance. Against this backdrop, we see no possibilities to pursue our dialogue as to sign a document which would enshrine the foundation for long-lasting good neighborly relations. We have expressed this position almost 1 year ago. I apologize, 2 years ago. It was done on March the 21st, 2021. Thank you very much. I would like to remind you that the Kuril Islands were accepted into the Soviet Union after World War II. It was enshrined in the international legislation. The Russian sovereignty over these territories is unquestionable. It is enshrined in the Constitution of the Russian Federation. Japan should accept the existing post-war realities. Thank you very much. Vesti, are you with us? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. During the main part of the briefing, during the introduction of the briefing, you already mentioned the international Russophile movement. Thank you very much for doing this. This was a very substantive remark. It was a very good one indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any questions left? Perhaps we missed someone. If there are no more questions, then goodbye. We will publish the materials that I mentioned. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Спасибо, всего доброго.